Hello and welcome to the RPG Blender, where we give lesser played games and forgotten settings the roll of the dice they deserve. I'm your host, Game Master George, and today we are finishing our look at 5 horror hurdles that you might encounter while trying to run your Halloween horror game. If you've missed any of our past videos, go ahead and check them out in the description or at this helpful playlist here. And if you found our previous tips helpful and want to be notified when our future videos go live, go ahead and click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can be notified when our next videos go up. And of course, if you'd like to see any of these tips and actions, you can go ahead and check out our Twitch channel at twitch.tv/rpgblender. We've started going live with some RPG content where you can come and hang out with us and watch us put these tips to the test. We've done a couple RPG live streams now, and we intend to continue doing so go ahead and give us a follow and come on by to get in on the action. Now, without any further delay, let's dive into 5 horror hurdles, making and breaking your world. If you ask any dungeon master what the largest problem that they face is, you're probably going to get many different answers, but there is one that is going to come up more often than you might expect, and that is the problem of getting your players invested in the world. In a horror game, this is especially important, because if your players aren't invested in your world, they're not going to be affected by anything that you throw at them. No matter how well you've executed the previous 4 tips, if your players are not invested in the world that you've created, it's not going to have any effect on them. So there are 2 distinct steps with this issue. First, we need to build their connection to the world. We need to put in place some things that they're going to be able to identify with in order to rope them in, get them to start caring about things. And then once they do, we move on to step 2, where we take those things and we break them. If we never build the connections, we can never break them, so it's important to get them built. What can you do to increase your players' involvement in your world? And this is going to be a hard one to hear, but some players just are not interested in or capable of doing so. And that's fine. Not everybody has to be the kind of role player who really gets invested in every world that they play in. The RPG world is large enough for the people who also want to just go out and kill things. But if you have people like that in your group, you probably don't want to involve them in this horror experience. If you've been watching these previous tips and wondering how you can get that one player in your group to actually dig into it, it's probably a sign that that person might not be the right kind that's going to be able to actually enjoy it. You know your players better than anyone. So the first step that you need to do is identify if your players are the kind that can actually get invested in the world. Once you know that, and once you've weaned down your group to those who can, your next step is to actually engage them in building the world. Lots of game masters go through this long process of building out their world, crafting each and every little nook in order to build something that feels like a living, breathing entity. I do it myself, and it's a fun experience, but I do it because I find it fun, not necessarily because it's what I think is going to lead to a great game for my players. What I know that my players are going to want is to have impact on the world. So when you're setting up the game, identify some aspects in your world that you can allow your players to define. These can be important NPCs in their starting location. It could be actually creating locations, or maybe historical events. Give your players a list of things that need to be fleshed out in your world, and ask them to build it into their character backstories. Ask each one of them to choose a different thing and somehow incorporate it into the story that they're writing for their character. Once they do that, they're not just creating their own character. It's easy to get invested in your own character that you're playing game after game after game. When they write something into their backstory, the chances are good that they're going to feel a similar connection to it. Even if they aren't interacting with that character or item or place on a daily basis, it forms something that is in their mind when they're playing their character. It's part of the backbone of who they are. So by engaging them from the very beginning and having them help define your world, you're actually working to weave not just their characters into your world, but also the players. This is a tip that I would actually recommend for any game. Coming up with these missing items and allowing your players to define them will allow them to build a better connection to any world, not just horror ones. It's just that with horror, it's so much more important. Once they've built their connections into the world, the next thing that you need to do, and this is very important, is you need to maintain the tone of the world. We talked about this a lot in part 1, about how it's important for you to set a tone from the beginning and then maintain it. But that goes not just for the tone of the game when they're playing, but it goes for the way your world was built. If you establish certain truths about your world, which you explain to them in their session 0, and they work into the backstories that they've been writing for your world, and then you go ahead and break them immediately, they lose investment. So you want to establish rules in your creation of your world. You want to explain them to your players, and then you need to follow them. We're going to put an asterisk on that because it's going to be adjusted later. But for right now, remember that in the general session, in the general day-to-day of your world, you want to maintain that consistency. Next, when your players are interacting with your world, you need to make sure that you're giving your NPCs realistic reactions to things. It can be very fun to go into a town and have some over-the-top NPC come in with their grandiose gestures and crazy mannerisms. And in a normal game, that's fine. But in a horror game, what it does is it creates a disconnect between the realism that you've been trying to build with their characters and the world, and the way that you're portraying your NPCs. When you do this with your NPCs, it becomes normal and acceptable for your players to do so with their characters. And once they devolve into that kind of over-the-top shenaniganry, you've lost them and it's going to be very hard to pull them back in. Set a tone for your world, keep to those rules, and make sure that your NPCs are behaving accordingly. Now, that does not mean that your world needs to be realistic. If your entire world is about over-the-top dramatics, then use that. Have that be built into your NPCs. Make sure that your NPCs are meeting that standard. The key here is just to make sure that everything that you're doing is consistent. You need to make sure that the characters that you are portraying fit the tone of your world, whatever that tone might be. Because that is how we're now going to break them. Because you see, your monster needs to defy these rules. These standards that you have built, your monster needs to fly in the face of them. So when you're making your monster, don't just try to think about the standard scary tropes. Instead, if you've been creating a world where, as we've mentioned, the over-the-top dramatics and mannerisms are the norm, create a monster that is serious and stoic, that moves about silently with little extra gestures. A creature masked not just by darkness, but by the very lack of its over-emphasized dramatics. Meanwhile, if you're creating a world that is gritty in its realism, give your creature abilities that defy the norm, that do things that are impossible in your world, that nothing else could possibly have done. Break the rules of your world with your creature. A good example of this that I can give from one of my own actual plays here on YouTube is our Night's Black Agents playthrough. See, I set up a world where the players thought that they were just going through a modern spy thriller, when in reality, this was a game of Night's Black Agents, where there is a vast vampiric conspiracy going on in the world. Normally, the players would know about that, because they know that they're going in to play a game of Night's Black Agents. However, I approached them with a game that they had never heard of before, and I explained it to them as a spy thriller. They then went off and made their goofy one-shot characters, and I played with it. I allowed them to make those characters, to grow with them, and to engage in all of their silly hijinks. And then at the end, at the climax of their mission, after they've dispatched the traitorous agents, they find the vampire, who very solemnly, very matter-of-factly, engaging with none of their nonsense, steps through the shadows to their car, takes the man that they'd knocked unconscious, rips open his skull and devours its brains. This sudden, graphic change in tone left them horrified, unable to react for a moment with anything other than mouths agape. It perfectly accomplished what I wanted, because I took the tone that they had established with their shenanigans, then broke it when it came time for the monster. Now, once you've broken it, there's still one important step, and that is how your world reacts. If your world reacts as if this is a normal event, then your players are going to lose a little bit of that hard-earned horror. So make sure that your NPCs are reacting to this monstrous event in the same way you would want your players to. Some of them may react with fear, anger, may descend into madness. Whatever reaction they have, make sure it fits with the tone of the world that you set in the beginning. This monster that you've made needs to be the only element that breaks the consistency of your world. What game do I think is a good example of this? I'm sure you expect me to say something like Call of Cthulhu. And yes, the sanity mechanic is a great way of monetizing the breaking of the world that I'm talking about here. But while the breaking is very important, the most important is the investment that you need to build in them toward your world. As such, the game that I'm going to recommend is one that focuses on that aspect, and that would be Kids on Bikes. Kids on Bikes is a fairly rules-light game detailing life in a normal 80s town, or at least a normal 80s town as it would have been portrayed in a supernatural movie. Think along the lines of Stranger Things, a town of strange events, where only the children seem to see what's going on. The player characters are those children going out into the world and attempting to find these strange events, uncover the truths, and protect their small town. Now, I mentioned that this is a rules-light game, and it's not the rules of gameplay that interest me here. Instead, it's the character building, all the stuff that happens before you actually get to the session. See, the first thing that your players are going to need to do is build your town for you. You, as the game master, do not define the town. Instead, you give your players a list of questions, and the players take turns answering them, slowly building out a picture of the town that they live in. These questions range from things like a chief industry in the area, the town's name, or Stranger Things, legends, or strange secret societies. And in doing so, your players get to define the world that they're about to adventure in. This builds immediate investment in the world. And moving beyond that, it's not just your world. No, as part of the character creation process, each of the player characters will need to take turns answering questions about the other player characters. They'll have to determine whether they have a positive or negative opinion of them, and then answer a random question from the appropriate table. And once they've done so, that character will need to answer the opposite back to them. So if Jesse has a positive opinion of Sam, then Sam will need to answer a negative question about Jesse. In doing so, you build this interweaving web of connections, both positive and negative, between all of the different characters. This adds an incredible new level of investment, not just into the world, but into the other characters. This makes them start to care about them, to care about these people that they've spent this time developing actual memories with. When their world starts to be shattered, and when their friends start to fall, the horror can truly sink in, because you've invested your players not just in their own character, but in the world and the other characters. And that's what you need to try to accomplish with your own game, regardless of what system you're running in. You need to try to make sure that your players care about not just themselves, but the world and each other. And if you can accomplish that, if you can get them invested in everything that's been put forward, then the other steps that we've outlined will allow you to create a truly horrific experience. Anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this series. If this has been of help to you, please like, comment, subscribe, but most important, keep watching. We'll be moving on to a new topic soon, so if you have something in mind that you'd like us to tackle, some problem that you've had, or some system that you'd like to learn how to run, let us know in the comments below. There's always more systems to learn, and our goal is to facilitate expanding the knowledge of these other systems, to make them more accessible, to broaden the horizons of the average gamer. If you'd like to see some of these other systems in play, you can check out our actual play series. It's here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts from. Meanwhile, we're streaming live games over on Twitch now, so go ahead and follow our channel at twitch.tv/RPGblender. Then come out and enjoy the excitement when we next go live with another new RPG. Anyway, thank you again, and remember, there's gaming outside the Forgotten Realms. They are rolling their relationship questions. Oh boy. And Megiddo has just redeemed Raise the Stakes.
What does that mean?
What does that do?
Ooh.
Did we die?
No, that means we're going to make the situation a little more intense, a little worse.
Oh, come on, Megiddo!
Wow! Megiddo, my
Excellent
man!
Time for you, Megiddo. Megiddo, do you have a suggestion for this, then?
Shared curse. Shared
Uh,
curse.
Oh,
Fight you.
man,
That doesn't make
beautiful.
sense. That doesn't make sense. The question is,
I mean,
What-
he
what
ups it to
curse
shared
she
curse.
was-
That is a thing.
well, I mean, just hear
Oh,
me out.
oh.
Hear me out. The idea
Uh-oh.
is to up the stakes for the current question, which is what affliction
Yeah,
was
so upping the
Amelia afflicted
stakes.
with.
I mean,
That
then
very
having
much
it affect
ups the
you, that
curse.
sure would.
All right,
We're
is that
just
your
gonna
choice,
dance
Megiddo?
to Rich's tune, aren't we?
This
We're
is
just
what
gonna
you get?
dance to his little dark
I've
fiddle
said-
over there
I've
in his
said a
dark
lot of
little
things.
room.
You know what? This is what the chat wants now,
Oh.
and they are the true.
Well,
you know,
obviously.
We are on the first instance of these channel points, and it has already done everything that I have ever hoped it could.